In 1971, a baby was born in a remote West Virginia hospital. This birth would shatter everything doctors thought they knew about human genetics. The infant's condition was so severe, so impossible, that medical staff stood in stunned silence. They realized they were witnessing the result of something that shouldn't exist in modern America. This wasn't just a birth defect or medical anomaly. This was living proof that somewhere in the mountains, a family had been practicing inbreeding so extreme that it had created a genetic nightmare. The nightmare defied nature itself. The baby that shocked 1971 was just the beginning of uncovering America's most disturbing family secret. This secret had been hidden for generations in the isolated hollows of Appalachia. But before we dive into this shocking revelation, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You won't miss more incredible stories tomorrow. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. The morning of March 15, 1971, started like any other at Charleston General Hospital in West Virginia. Nurses made their rounds. Doctors prepared for what they assumed would be routine deliveries. But nothing could have prepared the medical staff for the nightmare that would unfold in Delivery Room 3. A young woman from the remote mountains arrived in the final stages of labor. Dr. Margaret Sullivan was the attending physician. She had delivered hundreds of babies over her 20-year career. She thought she had seen every possible complication and abnormality that childbirth could present. But when the infant finally emerged into the harsh fluorescent lights of the delivery room, the seasoned doctor found herself staring at something impossible. This defied every principle of human genetics she had learned in medical school. The baby's head was grotesquely enlarged. It was swollen to nearly twice the size it should have been. The skull was so malformed that the fontanelles hadn't closed properly. This created soft spots that pulsed visibly with each heartbeat. The facial features were so severely distorted that the tiny eyes seemed lost in the expanse of deformed bone and flesh. Nurse Patricia Webb had assisted in the delivery. She later recalled how the entire room fell into stunned silence. The medical team realized they were witnessing something that shouldn't exist in modern America. This was a level of genetic damage so extreme that it suggested generations of systematic inbreeding had occurred to produce such catastrophic results. The infant's limbs were twisted and malformed. Fingers were webbed together. Bones seemed to bend at impossible angles. The baby's attempts to cry produced only weak, gurgling sounds. These sounds spoke to severe developmental problems affecting even the most basic life functions. Dr. Sullivan immediately ordered a battery of tests and examinations. But even before the results came back, she knew she was looking at the product of something far more disturbing than a random genetic accident or isolated birth defect. The combination of abnormalities was too systematic, too comprehensive. This could only be the result of a bloodline that had been compromised by generations of close relative breeding. The hospital staff who witnessed the birth would later describe it as one of the most disturbing moments of their careers. This wasn't just because of the infant's condition. It was because of the realization that somewhere in the mountains surrounding their city, a family had been practicing incest so extreme and so prolonged that it had produced this living testament to genetic collapse. As word of the birth spread through the hospital corridors, doctors and nurses gathered in hushed groups. They discussed the implications of what they had witnessed. They wondered how such a thing could happen in 1971 America, where medical knowledge and social services should have prevented such a catastrophic failure of human genetics from ever reaching this point. Within hours of the shocking birth, Dr. Sullivan found herself leading an unprecedented medical investigation. She began the disturbing process of tracing the infant's family history. She started with the young mother who lay recovering in the hospital bed. Her own physical appearance told a story that made the doctor's blood run cold with its implications. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s but possessed the cognitive abilities of a much younger child. She could barely communicate beyond pointing and making primitive sounds. Her own facial features bore the unmistakable signs of genetic damage. This suggested she too was the product of generations of inbreeding within the same isolated bloodline. Hospital social worker Janet Morrison was called in to assist with gathering family information. What she discovered through painstaking interviews with local officials and examination of scattered county records painted a picture so disturbing that she initially refused to believe the evidence before her eyes. The birth certificates and marriage licenses that Morrison managed to collect from various county courthouses revealed a web of relationships that violated every principle of genetic health. The same surnames appeared repeatedly across generations in combinations that should have been impossible if the family had been following normal marriage patterns. Brothers had married sisters. Cousins had wed cousins. In some cases, the documentation suggested that fathers had produced children with their own daughters. This created a genetic bottleneck so severe that the family's gene pool had become little more than a stagnant pond of accumulated mutations and chromosomal damage. Dr. Sullivan enlisted the help of geneticist Dr. Robert Chen from West Virginia University. He arrived at the hospital 3 days after the birth. He immediately began constructing what would become one of the most disturbing family trees ever documented in American medical history. Chen's analysis revealed that the infant's parents were not only first cousins but also shared grandparents who were themselves siblings. This created a level of genetic overlap that approached the theoretical limits of what human biology could survive. The family tree that emerged from their investigation looked less like a traditional genealogical chart and more like a twisted spiral that folded in on itself repeatedly. The same names appeared in multiple generations. These relationships created genetic redundancy so extreme that beneficial genes had been systematically eliminated from the bloodline over decades of systematic inbreeding. What made the discovery even more horrifying was the realization that this wasn't the result of a few isolated incidents of inappropriate relationships. Rather, this was a systematic pattern that had been maintained for over 50 years. This suggested that the family had either been completely unaware of the genetic consequences of their choices or had been so isolated from mainstream society that normal taboos and knowledge about the dangers of inbreeding had never reached their remote mountain community. Dr. Chen's investigation into the family's origins led him deep into the archives of Raleigh County. Dusty records from the early 1900s revealed the story of John Isom Whitaker, a coal miner whose decision to abandon civilization would unknowingly set in motion one of the most catastrophic genetic disasters in American history. John was a man shaped by the harsh realities of industrial life in West Virginia. Mining accidents claimed lives daily. Company towns controlled every aspect of workers' existence. But unlike his fellow miners who found solace in community and shared struggle, John developed an almost pathological distrust of authority. He had an obsession with self-sufficiency that would drive him to seek absolute isolation from the modern world. Records from the Beckley Mining Company show that John worked the coal seams for nearly 15 years before abruptly walking away from his job in 1901. He took his wife Martha and their 3 young children deeper into the mountains than any company roads or government maps had ever reached. The land that John chose for his homestead was a remote hollow in what would later become Odd, West Virginia. This was a place so inaccessible that even the most adventurous hunters and trappers rarely ventured into its depths. It was surrounded by ridges so steep and forests so dense that the family would effectively disappear from all official records for decades at a time. John built his cabin with obsessive attention to detail. He created not just a home but a fortress against the outside world. It had hidden root cellars, multiple escape routes, and defensive positions. This suggested he expected to defend his family against intruders who might try to force them back into the society he had rejected. What John could never have anticipated was how his dream of perfect isolation would transform into a genetic prison for his descendants. The very remoteness that protected his family from government interference also cut them off from the genetic diversity that human populations require to remain healthy across generations. The children who grew up in John's mountain fortress knew no other families. They met no potential marriage partners outside their immediate relatives. They developed a worldview so insular that the concept of marrying outside their bloodline would eventually become not just foreign but actively threatening to their sense of identity and security. John's decision to reject the corrupting influence of modern society seemed reasonable and even admirable in 1901. Industrial accidents and government overreach were genuine threats to working families. But the isolation that was supposed to protect his descendants would instead become the mechanism of their destruction. This created a closed genetic system where harmful mutations would accumulate with each generation until the family's biological foundation began to collapse under the weight of its own genetic redundancy. The tragedy of John Isom Whitaker was not that he was evil or malicious. He was a man whose reasonable fears and legitimate desire for independence led him to make choices that would damn his bloodline for over a century. This proves that sometimes the road to genetic hell is paved with the best of intentions and the most understandable human impulses. As John Whitaker's children reached adulthood in the 1920s, the first generation of genetic consequences began to manifest. These should have served as urgent warnings about the path the family was taking. But the isolation that had created these problems also prevented anyone from recognizing them as the dangerous symptoms of genetic collapse they truly represented. Samuel, John's eldest son, married his sister Rebecca in 1923. This union produced children who showed subtle but unmistakable signs of intellectual disability and physical abnormalities. The family attributed these to the harsh mountain environment rather than the biological catastrophe that was actually unfolding within their bloodline. The children born from this first generation of sibling marriage displayed learning difficulties that made basic tasks challenging. They had speech impediments that prevented clear communication. They showed minor physical deformities that included slightly misshapen skulls and coordination problems. These affected their ability to perform even simple manual labor. Martha, John's daughter, formed a relationship with her first cousin Thomas. Their offspring exhibited more pronounced versions of the same problems. These included severe stuttering, difficulty with basic mathematics and reading, and a tendency toward repetitive behaviors. This suggested neurological damage was beginning to accumulate in the family's genetic heritage. What made these early warning signs particularly tragic was how the family interpreted them as evidence of their mountain hardiness rather than symptoms of genetic breakdown. Older family members praised children who struggled with speech as being quiet and thoughtful. They dismissed obvious learning disabilities as proof that book learning wasn't necessary for mountain survival. The isolation that John had created meant that the family had no frame of reference for normal human development. They had no understanding that children in the outside world typically learned to read by age 6, spoke clearly by age 4, and possessed coordination skills that allowed them to perform age-appropriate tasks without the struggles that were becoming commonplace in the Whitaker bloodline. Local church records from the 1930s, discovered decades later by Dr. Chen's investigation, contained scattered references to the peculiar family in the Deep Hollow. Their children seemed touched by the Lord in ways that made them different from other mountain folk. This suggested that even the occasional outsider who encountered the family noticed something disturbing about their development patterns. The few government officials who ventured into the remote area during the Great Depression to conduct census counts noted irregularities in the family's reporting. Ages didn't match apparent development levels. Family relationships seemed deliberately obscured. But these observations were filed away as curiosities rather than investigated as potential signs of systematic abuse or genetic damage. Perhaps most disturbing was how quickly the family adapted to these abnormalities. They developed a culture where intellectual disability was normalized. Physical deformities were accepted as natural variations. The idea of seeking outside help became associated with betraying the family's sacred isolation from the corrupting influence of the modern world that had driven John into the mountains in the first place. By the 1940s, the second and third generations of Whitaker descendants had created a genetic nightmare that was accelerating beyond anything the family could comprehend. Cousins married cousins who were already the products of sibling unions. This created levels of genetic overlap that pushed human biology to its absolute breaking point. The children born during this period displayed abnormalities so severe that they challenged the very definition of normal human development. They had enlarged skulls that required special care during birth. Their limbs formed incorrectly and required constant assistance for basic movement. Their cognitive abilities were so limited that many family members never progressed beyond the mental capacity of toddlers despite reaching physical adulthood. Robert Whitaker was the son of the original sibling marriage between Samuel and Rebecca. He married his own first cousin Mary in 1947. They produced children whose genetic damage was so profound that they could barely communicate through recognizable speech. Instead, they developed a primitive system of grunts, gestures, and facial expressions that served as their primary means of interaction with other family members. The physical deformities became increasingly dramatic with each generation. Children were born with skulls that grew to abnormal sizes. This created heads so large and misshapen that normal hats and clothing couldn't accommodate their proportions. Their bodies remained stunted and underdeveloped. This created a grotesque disproportion that made basic activities like walking and eating into daily struggles that required constant family assistance. Medical knowledge that might have explained these devastating changes remained completely absent from the family's isolated world. The concept of genetic counseling didn't exist. The connection between close relative reproduction and birth defects was never understood. This left the family to interpret each new abnormality as either God's will or simply another challenge to be endured in their mountain existence. The third generation, born in the 1950s and early 1960s, represented the point where genetic collapse began to threaten the family's very survival. Fertility rates dropped dramatically due to the accumulated genetic damage. Infant mortality soared to levels that would have triggered immediate medical intervention in any civilized community. The surviving children displayed combinations of physical and mental abnormalities that made independent living virtually impossible. Perhaps most tragically, the family's isolation had become so complete that they had lost the ability to recognize their condition as abnormal. Instead, they developed elaborate justifications and explanations that framed their genetic deterioration as evidence of their special status as chosen people who were different from the corrupt outside world that their ancestor John had rejected decades earlier. The few outsiders who occasionally encountered family members during this period described encounters with people who seemed to exist in a parallel reality where normal human development had been replaced by something so disturbing that witnesses struggled to find words to describe what they had seen. This led to whispered rumors and local legends that only served to further isolate the family from any possibility of outside intervention or assistance. By 1970, the genetic spiral had created a family where normal reproduction had become nearly impossible. Most children required constant care throughout their lives. The accumulated damage of 50 years of systematic inbreeding had set the stage for the catastrophic birth that would finally expose their secret to the medical world in 1971. In the weeks following the shocking birth at Charleston General Hospital, Dr. Sullivan and her team launched the most comprehensive genetic investigation in West Virginia medical history. They were determined to understand how such extreme genetic damage could exist undetected in modern America. They wanted to know what could be done to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The medical team's first breakthrough came when they managed to locate the infant's father. He was a man in his 30s whose own appearance immediately confirmed their worst fears about the scope of the genetic disaster they were confronting. He displayed obvious signs of intellectual disability, severe facial asymmetry, and physical coordination problems that made simple conversations nearly impossible to conduct. Dr. Chen's genetic analysis of blood samples from both parents revealed a level of genetic similarity that approached what scientists typically see in laboratory experiments designed to study the absolute limits of inbreeding. The DNA overlap was so extensive that the parents shared more genetic material than most siblings in normal populations. The investigation expanded when hospital social workers convinced local authorities to conduct a welfare check on the family's remote compound. This led to the discovery of additional family members whose conditions ranged from moderate intellectual disability to severe genetic deformities that required constant medical attention that they had never received. What the medical team found most disturbing was the systematic nature of the genetic collapse. Each generation showed progressively worse abnormalities in a pattern that suggested the family had been practicing close relative breeding not occasionally or accidentally, but as their standard approach to reproduction for over half a century. The hospital's attempts to provide genetic counseling and family planning education encountered a brick wall of incomprehension. The family members who were capable of basic communication seemed genuinely unable to understand why their reproductive choices were problematic or how their isolation had contributed to their genetic deterioration. Dr. Sullivan's team documented over 40 distinct genetic abnormalities within the family bloodline. These ranged from relatively minor learning disabilities in the older generations to catastrophic birth defects in the most recent children. This created a medical case study that would later be used in genetics textbooks as an example of what happens when human populations become completely isolated from genetic diversity. The most heartbreaking aspect of the investigation was discovering that many of the family's current reproductive age adults were themselves so intellectually impaired that they lacked the cognitive capacity to understand the concept of genetic relationships or make informed decisions about family planning. This created an ethical nightmare for medical professionals who wanted to prevent future tragedies but couldn't obtain meaningful consent for intervention measures. Hospital records from this period reveal the profound moral dilemma faced by the medical team. They found themselves confronting a situation where the traditional approaches to genetic counseling and family planning were completely inadequate because the very people who most needed help were least capable of understanding or participating in their own treatment decisions. The 1971 investigation ultimately documented what geneticists would later describe as one of the most extreme cases of human inbreeding depression ever recorded in medical literature. This was a genetic catastrophe so severe that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the limits of human biological resilience and the minimum levels of genetic diversity required for sustainable human reproduction. As Dr. Sullivan's team delved deeper into their investigation, they uncovered a shocking truth that was almost as disturbing as the genetic catastrophe itself. Local authorities, social services, and community leaders had known about the Whitaker family's condition for decades. But they had systematically chosen silence and willful ignorance over intervention and protection of vulnerable human beings. County records dating back to the 1940s revealed a pattern of deliberate negligence that bordered on criminal conspiracy. Social workers filed reports that documented obvious signs of genetic damage and intellectual disability. But then they inexplicably failed to follow up with investigations or interventions that were mandated by state law for the protection of vulnerable populations. Sheriff's Department logs from the 1950s and 1960s contained multiple entries describing visits to the Whitaker compound in response to neighbor complaints about strange sounds and unusual behavior. But these official reports were deliberately vague and incomplete. This suggested that law enforcement officers had witnessed disturbing conditions but chose to classify them as family matters, rather than potential cases of abuse or neglect requiring state intervention. The most damning evidence emerged from the files of the Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Sullivan discovered correspondence between local officials and state administrators discussing the Whitaker problem in language that revealed they fully understood the family's genetic situation but viewed it as an embarrassment to be hidden rather than a humanitarian crisis requiring immediate action. Social worker Margaret Thompson had worked in the region during the 1950s. She was tracked down by hospital investigators and reluctantly admitted that she had personally witnessed conditions at the Whitaker compound that should have triggered emergency removal of children from the home. But her supervisor had ordered her to let sleeping dogs lie and avoid creating publicity that might reflect poorly on the county's social services. Even more disturbing was the discovery that religious leaders in the area had been aware of the family's situation since the 1930s. Church records contained references to special prayers for the afflicted family in the Deep Hollow, and discussions among ministers about whether the family's condition represented divine punishment or testing that should not be interfered with through worldly intervention. Local school officials had systematically ignored the fact that no Whitaker children had attended classes for over 30 years, despite state laws requiring education for all minors. Superintendents filed false reports claiming that the family had moved out of district rather than investigating why an entire bloodline had seemingly vanished from the educational system. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond individual failures to encompass institutional policies that actively discouraged investigation into isolated families. County commissioners explicitly instructed social workers to focus their limited resources on more manageable cases, rather than venturing into remote areas where interventions might prove difficult or expensive to implement. Perhaps most shocking was the revelation that multiple medical professionals had encountered Whitaker family members over the years and recognized obvious signs of genetic damage and intellectual disability. But they had chosen to provide minimal treatment and avoid asking questions that might have exposed the systematic abuse and neglect that had allowed this genetic nightmare to continue unchecked for over half a century. The cover-up conspiracy represented a moral failure so profound that it implicated an entire community in the perpetuation of human suffering. This revealed how easily vulnerable people can be abandoned when their situation becomes too uncomfortable for others to acknowledge or too complicated for institutions to address with the resources and commitment that genuine protection of human dignity requires. The months following the shocking revelation of 1971 brought a flurry of activity from government agencies and social services. They suddenly discovered an urgent need to address a situation they had ignored for decades. But the interventions that finally materialized proved to be too little, too late, and too poorly coordinated to make any meaningful difference in the lives of the Whitaker family members who desperately needed help. State social workers descended on the remote compound with promises of assistance and support. But they quickly discovered that the family's genetic damage and intellectual disabilities had progressed to such an extent that traditional rehabilitation and social services were completely inadequate to address their complex needs. This left well-meaning caseworkers feeling overwhelmed and ultimately defeated by the scope of the tragedy they encountered. The infant whose birth had exposed the family's secret died within 6 months despite intensive medical care. It succumbed to the multiple organ failures and developmental abnormalities that made survival impossible. But this tragedy served only to highlight how many other family members were living with similar genetic damage that would prove fatal without constant medical supervision that the state was neither equipped nor committed to provide. Attempts to provide basic education and life skills training to the younger family members revealed the heartbreaking reality that decades of genetic deterioration had created cognitive limitations so severe that most Whitakers were incapable of learning even simple tasks like basic hygiene, food preparation, or money management. This made independent living impossible and required levels of institutional care that West Virginia's underfunded social services system could not sustain. The few family members who possessed enough cognitive ability to understand what was happening to them proved to be the most tragic cases of all. They could comprehend their situation just enough to realize they were trapped in bodies and minds that would never allow them to live normal lives. This led to episodes of depression and despair that no amount of counseling or medication could adequately address. Housing became an immediate crisis when investigators determined that the family's mountain compound was uninhabitable by any reasonable standard. It lacked basic utilities, proper sanitation, and structural integrity necessary for human habitation. But finding alternative accommodations for people with such severe disabilities and behavioral challenges proved nearly impossible within the existing social services infrastructure. The state's solution was to scatter the family members among various institutions and group homes throughout West Virginia. This effectively destroyed the only social bonds and support systems the Whitakers had ever known while providing them with sterile institutional care that met their basic survival needs but ignored their emotional and psychological requirements for human connection and dignity. Medical care improved dramatically for those family members who were placed in supervised facilities. But the genetic damage that had accumulated over generations proved largely irreversible. Most Whitakers continued to suffer from the same intellectual disabilities, physical deformities, and health problems that had defined their existence before the outside world discovered their plight. Perhaps most tragically, the publicity surrounding the family's exposure led to widespread curiosity and exploitation. Journalists, researchers, and medical students treated the surviving Whitakers as fascinating specimens rather than human beings deserving of privacy and respect. This created additional trauma for people who were already struggling to adapt to a world they had never been prepared to navigate. By the mid-1970s, most of the intervention efforts had quietly faded away as the initial shock and outrage gave way to the reality that helping the Whitaker family required long-term commitment and resources that society was unwilling to provide. This left the survivors to exist in a liminal space between their destroyed mountain isolation and a modern world that had acknowledged their suffering but proved incapable of truly addressing the consequences of decades of systematic neglect and genetic catastrophe. In 2004, more than 3 decades after the medical community had supposedly discovered and addressed the Whitaker family tragedy, photographer Mark Lyda made a shocking discovery. This would reveal just how little had actually changed for the survivors of America's most extreme case of genetic collapse. Lyda had spent years documenting forgotten communities across America. He first heard rumors about the family from locals who spoke in hushed tones about those people up in the hollow, who lived in conditions that defied modern understanding. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of what he found when he finally located the decaying compound where the remaining Whitakers continued to exist in circumstances that were arguably worse than they had been in 1971. The family members he encountered represented the final generation of the genetic nightmare that had begun with John Isom Whitaker's decision to isolate his bloodline. But decades of supposed intervention and assistance had done nothing to improve their living conditions, their access to medical care, or their integration into any form of normal human society. Ray Whitaker was one of the most functional survivors. He could barely communicate beyond primitive grunts and gestures. His attempts at speech produced sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his damaged neurological system. His physical appearance told the story of a lifetime spent without adequate nutrition, medical care, or basic human dignity despite all the promises made by social services after the 1971 revelation. Betty and other family members displayed levels of intellectual disability and physical deterioration that suggested they had actually regressed since the initial discovery. They lived in squalor that violated every standard of human habitation while subsisting on whatever food they could scavenge or receive from the occasional charitable visitor who took pity on their obvious suffering. The compound itself had become even more decrepit over the decades. Structures barely qualified as shelter. They provided minimal protection from the elements. There was no running water, no electricity, and sanitation conditions that would have been considered appalling in the poorest developing nations, let alone in 21st century America. What made Lyda's discovery even more disturbing was the realization that the family's situation had been allowed to deteriorate not through ignorance or oversight, but through the same systematic abandonment that had characterized their treatment for over a century. Social services agencies had quietly closed their files and withdrawn support once the initial publicity died down and public attention moved on to other tragedies. The surviving Whitakers had been forgotten by the very systems that had promised to help them. They were left to exist in a twilight zone between life and death where their basic survival needs were barely met while their humanity was effectively denied through benign neglect that proved just as destructive as the active conspiracy of silence that had preceded it. Lyda's photographs and documentation revealed that the genetic damage continued to manifest in new and horrifying ways. Family members displayed progressive deterioration that suggested their compromised biology was continuing to break down even as they struggled to maintain some semblance of human existence in their isolated mountain prison. The filmmaker found himself confronting the same ethical dilemmas that had faced medical professionals in 1971. He wondered whether exposing their condition would help generate resources and support or simply subject them to additional exploitation and voyeurism from a society that seemed more interested in being shocked by their suffering than committed to addressing the systematic failures that had created and perpetuated their tragedy across multiple generations of willful neglect and institutional abandonment. As we reach the end of 2024, the few surviving members of the Whitaker family continue to exist in their remote West Virginia hollow. They are living testament to one of the most profound failures of American society and a genetic tragedy that began with one man's reasonable desire for independence but evolved into a century-long nightmare of systematic abandonment and institutional neglect. The family's story serves as a devastating indictment of how easily vulnerable people can disappear from society's awareness when their needs become too complex, too expensive, or too uncomfortable for institutions to address with the sustained commitment that genuine human dignity requires. More than 50 years after the shocking birth that first exposed their condition to the medical world, the Whitakers remain trapped in the same cycle of poverty, isolation, and genetic deterioration that has defined their existence since John Isom's fateful decision to reject civilization in favor of mountain solitude that became a biological prison for his descendants. Their genetic nightmare represents the end of their bloodline. The surviving family members are too damaged by generations of inbreeding to produce viable offspring. This makes them witnesses to the extinction of their own genetic heritage and the final chapter in a story that began with dreams of freedom but ended in biological catastrophe. The broader implications of the Whitaker tragedy extend far beyond their individual suffering to encompass fundamental questions about American society's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members. This includes the adequacy of social safety nets designed to prevent such systematic abandonment, and the moral obligations that come with knowledge of extreme human suffering occurring within our own borders. Their story reveals how geographic isolation can become a convenient excuse for institutional neglect. It shows how poverty and disability can render people invisible to systems that are supposed to protect them. It demonstrates how easily good intentions can fade into bureaucratic indifference when addressing human suffering requires sustained effort and significant resources over extended periods of time. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the conditions that created the Whitaker family tragedy continue to exist throughout rural America. Poverty, isolation, and inadequate social services combine to create environments where vulnerable people can suffer in silence while society congratulates itself on progress and enlightenment that somehow never reaches the darkest corners of our national landscape. The genetic horror that began with one man's choice to live beyond the boundaries of human society ultimately became a mirror reflecting our own moral failures. It reflects our willingness to abandon those whose suffering challenges our comfort, and our tendency to treat shocking discoveries as temporary entertainment rather than calls to sustained action and genuine reform. The Whitaker family's legacy should serve as a permanent reminder that human dignity cannot be conditional on genetic normalcy, geographic accessibility, or social conformity. Our commitment to protecting vulnerable people must be measured not by our initial reactions to shocking revelations but by our willingness to maintain support and advocacy long after the cameras stop rolling and public attention moves on to newer tragedies. Their story challenges us to examine our own communities for signs of abandonment and neglect. We must strengthen social safety nets that should prevent such tragedies. We must ensure that the genetic nightmare that consumed 4 generations of the Whitaker family becomes not just a cautionary tale but a catalyst for building a more compassionate society that truly leaves no one behind. This must happen regardless of how uncomfortable their suffering might make us or how difficult their needs might be to address with the quick fixes and temporary interventions that characterize so much of our approach to human suffering in modern America.